goner.
I'm usually strong enough to make it through anything, but my body felt like it had been through a war.
I was going to lose her. On one occasion, they had to stick her over 30 times.
She was deteriorating so rapidly.
My greatest fear is that I was going to say goodbye to my friend.
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. Ann Hummel, a seemingly healthy 36-year-old, is shaken by a series of headaches that leave her totally incapacitated. And it isn't long before Ann and her family begin to fear the worst.
I knew that I was really sick, and I thought for sure I was going to die.
Then, Jake and Brenda Kalmalot are overjoyed when their first child, Isabel, is born. But joy quickly turns to fear as Isabel goes from the nursery to the intensive care unit within the first week of her life.
Making the diagnosis soon was the most critical point. Even hours matter in these patients.
In the summer of 2001, Ann Hummel was a healthy 36-year-old mother of four who worked alongside her husband in the sales office of an upscale resort in Orlando, Florida.
We'd work together from about 7:30 till around 2 o'clock, and then we'd just go have some fun and then spend time with the family.
We lived on a lake, so we'd go boating, we'd go to the gym, we'd go rollerblading.
Ann was always in great shape. She always took care of herself, very goal-oriented, just really full of life.
Ann and her family are busy living life to the fullest, until one day in August of that year, when Ann notices that she's not feeling like herself.
I was having headache and sinus pressures.
She had mentioned maybe it was due to an allergy, and Ann, being Ann, very positive, didn't pay that much attention to it.
When she gets home from work, she tries to relieve the pounding in her head with an over-the-counter pain medication. But over the next 3 days, the agonizing headaches don't let up. Concerned, Ann checks in with her primary care doctor.
She pressed on my sinuses, my sinus cavities, and figured that it was a sinus infection.
His doctor prescribes a course of antibiotics, which she diligently takes, and a few days later, the pain is gone.
I thought it's cleared up now, so hopefully that's it.
But much to Ann's surprise, over the next few months, she continues to suffer from frequent headaches and finds herself going back to the doctor over and over again. Each time, her physician is confident that she is just suffering from recurring sinus infections and keeps giving her prescriptions for antibiotics.
I'm not one to get sick, so it wasn't making sense that suddenly I'm getting sick every couple months. It was very worrisome to me.
Then, in the spring of 2002, the excruciating headaches return yet again, but this time, they are worse than ever.
It's probably the third week of March, and I get a sinus infection, but this one seems different. It is intensely painful, the headache is, and I'm taking over-the-counter pain medicine constantly now, up to about 8 a day.
As someone that has a sinus problem, I used to get headaches, but nothing like she described. The headaches were just so severe.
Ann checks in with her doctor again and is given yet another course of antibiotics. But like every time in the past, they don't help for very long. In fact, Ann is feeling worse than she's ever felt before and is beginning to wonder if something far more serious has seized control of her body.
I kept expecting them to give me the right antibiotic or just to figure out what was wrong with me, and I was beginning to feel completely hopeless and that nobody was ever going to figure it out.
On a Wednesday morning in December 2004, Brenda Kalmalot gives birth to a baby girl, who she and her husband Jake christen Isabel.
She was so beautiful. I was so glad to have her.
I didn't feel as scared as I thought I'd be.
She was just, just gorgeous.
But the next morning, Brenda notices something strange.
I was trying to breastfeed Isabel. She was a little sleepy, so I was having a hard time keeping her awake for the time they said I needed to be feeding her. 5 minutes is what she would do. They wanted her to feed for 20 minutes to half an hour.
Despite multiple visits to the family doctor, Ann's crippling symptoms have not improved. In fact, they have intensified.
I would have over-the-counter pain medicine right by my bed, and I would have 3 to 4 of them before I would even start my day.
We always did things after work, and she wasn't able to do the things that she enjoyed, so all of a sudden not to have your friend go with you to the things that we were so used to doing on a daily basis and to see her suffering, it was very frustrating for all of us.
Almost like clockwork now, she checks back in with her doctor. But this time, much to Anne's relief, she is sent for a CAT scan of her sinuses and is hopeful that the results will finally reveal some clue as to what's been triggering the debilitating symptoms.
I had to wait probably a week to get the results back, so the whole time I'm in awful pain, and I'm up to probably about 12 over-the-counter pain medicines a day. And they finally call me and tell me, well, we know the source of all your pain. You have maxillary sinusitis.
Maxillary sinusitis is a type of infection that affects the sinuses behind your cheekbones and causes intense pain. Her primary care physician immediately refers Anne to an ear, nose, and throat specialist for further consultation. While she's thankful to finally have some answer, she's exasperated when she finds out that she's going to have to wait 2 weeks for the next available appointment.
She was deteriorating so rapidly, I didn't think she could function for a short period of time unless we got some type of answers quickly and some type of solution very, very fast.
And by the end of the day, Isabel starts looking a little yellow.
It just looked like there was yellow dye, just like she was playing in paint.
Doctors tell the Kalmalats it is jaundice, a very common condition in a newborn caused by elevated levels of a substance called bilirubin. It is easily remedied with exposure to sunlight.
We were under instructions to keep her under an open window in only a diaper to help her bilirubin levels go down.
But a week later, she reaches her breaking point.
I was at work one day, and I called the doctor's office, and I said, this cannot be maxillary sinusitis. I cannot handle this pain. She said, well, you're just going to have to wait for your doctor's appointment because I cannot do anything more.
Overwhelmed by the pain, Anne unexpectedly discovers one way to temporarily ease her agony.
I would just take a chair and I would just tilt it back as far as it would go on its legs and put my head back against the wall. And somehow that would help alleviate the pain some.
Now, as awkward as it may seem, Anne is spending all of her free time in this position as she counts down the days to her appointment with the ear, nose, and throat specialist. Then, without any warning, a strange new symptom emerges.
I remember noticing a fluid coming out of my left nostril, and it was just dampness that was always there.
She was always wiping her nostril. She was kind of embarrassed because obviously she would have to meet with clients.
Armed with a purse full of tissues, Anne manages as best she can, but it isn't long before yet another strange symptom begins to develop.
I also noticed a kind of a metallic type taste in my mouth. It would be as if you had eaten something for breakfast or lunch that had left a bad taste in your mouth. I just could not get rid of it.
She hated that. She would constantly want to brush her teeth or do something to get the taste out of her mouth.
We would buy packs and packs and packs of gum. So she was constantly chewing gum.
Anne assumes everything she's experiencing is related to her sinuses draining, but each passing day is becoming harder and harder to get through.
I hadn't given up to the point that I was going to stay in bed all day. To me, that would be just like, admitting defeat. So I would just try to save my energy to be able to go in and work. If I could just make it from 7:30 to 1 o'clock, then I could go home and lay down.
I would take care of things because obviously she was in too much pain to deal with it. And I'd get the kids up, get them to school, work, come home, take care of the house.
My kids were not coping very well with seeing me sick and laying down all the time. At this point, they would have to see me in bed. If I was not at work, I was in bed.
It was very hard to watch the children not able to really communicate with their mom because she was in bed. We had to be very sensitive every time we walked in that room, how to approach her, how to talk to her, and how to sit on the bed because the headaches were so severe.
You don't know what to do. You feel at the mercy of God to do something.
But the next day, Isabel doesn't seem to be any less yellow.
On Saturday, we took her to the doctor's office because she was still a little jaundiced.
And something else has started to bother them.
She was very lethargic. She began sleeping more and more, and she would nurse for just a few minutes and fall back asleep.
They ended up poking a couple holes in her heel and milking blood out of it. Do blood tests to get a little vial full.
When the results come back, the doctor is confused. Isabel's bilirubin levels haven't decreased at all. In fact, they've gotten higher.
He sent us Sunday to go to the lab, and they took another blood test, and her bilirubin levels were even higher. And he called us after we had been home for about an hour from that, and sent us to the hospital.
Then, just 2 days before her long-awaited doctor's appointment, while she's meeting with clients at work, something completely unexpected happens.
I was with the husband and wife sitting at the table, and I got up to go get their paperwork. I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't even read the paper. And I started to walk back to my table, and I couldn't even remember where I was sitting.
Frightened by the abrupt change in her vision and her disorientation, Anne excuses herself. Moments later, she begins to feel like she's going to faint and immediately tells her boss that she needs to leave, now.
He said, what's wrong with you? And I said, I'm really sick, I have to go. He said, you can't drive. I said, I'm going.
Terrified, Anne rushes to her car and calls Tom.
She said, I'm in such pain and I can't see to drive.
Tom said that he was going to call an ambulance, and I told him no, that I needed to just go home and lay down and I was going to be fine. And he said I needed to go to the hospital right now.
As Anne's vision sharpens a bit, she gives in, but insists on driving herself to her doctor's office.
It was amazing she could even drive. She had slurred speech. She couldn't walk unassisted. So I walked her in to see her primary care once again.
And she again determined that I had maxillary sinusitis and that, you know, my appointment was only in a day or two now with the ENT, and that probably I should just go home and rest and wait for that.
When the Kalmalats arrive at the hospital, Isabel is rushed into the intensive care unit. If the newborn's bilirubin levels are too high for too long, she could suffer brain damage.
They put her in an incubator and put these bright lights on her, these blue lights, and they put little sunglasses over her eyes to protect her eyes.
The blue lights provide a high dose of UV rays that should help break down the bilirubins.
They said nothing to worry about. Should be a few more days, you'll be able to take her home again.
Brenda and Jake are relieved that Isabel is finally getting the necessary treatment, but seeing their newborn in such distress is torture.
She spent all of her time, except for when I was feeding her, lying in the incubator. And she'd be crying, and we couldn't move her because we were trying to get the levels to drop.
And there were 2 holes in the side of the incubator that you could put your arms through. Brenda would be trying to just pat her through the holes in the side and soothe her that way.
Tom and Anne return home frustrated beyond belief. Now they can only hope that the specialist will be able to tell them exactly what's causing the mysterious symptoms.
It was like there was a fire burning in your head. My balance was starting to go. I couldn't even go to the bathroom without Tom helping me. I didn't know what was happening. I was scared at that point.
The next morning, Anne is so weak that Tom has to get her dressed to go to the appointment with the ear, nose, and throat specialist. And almost as soon as he sets eyes on Anne, the doctor knows that something is very wrong.
He had me try to stand up and close my eyes, which of course I couldn't even stand up without help. So standing up and closing my eyes was completely out of the question. I fell over.
Within a matter of minutes, he said, this is not sinusitis. This is a neurological problem, and you need an MRI, stat.
The doctor immediately sends Anne for an MRI of her brain. A few hours later, the couple heads home, hopeful that finally this doctor will be able to solve Anne's case once and for all. Then they get the call they've been so anxiously waiting for.
He said there was nothing wrong. I knew that I was really sick, but I just didn't know what it was.
7 months after the headaches first started, a brain MRI has revealed nothing out of the ordinary.
I didn't know what to think anymore. I knew for one thing that it was not maxillary sinusitis. I just didn't know how we were going to get the answer to what it was.
Now Anne seems to be deteriorating at a breakneck speed, and Tom isn't sure he can take care of his wife on his own.
She's lying in bed and looked at me and said she needed to go to the bathroom, and when she sat up, she just passed out. So I determined, within about a millisecond, I got to get her to the hospital.
Frantic, Tom carries Anne to the car and drives as fast as he can to the hospital.
I guess I had been unconscious. I don't know. He took me into the doctor's office, I know that, and I guess he had tried to put me into a chair, and I fell onto the floor and passed out.
Immediately, an emergency room team springs into action, taking Anne's vital signs. Once they've stabilized her, she is sent in for a spinal tap, a common procedure performed when a patient has incessant, unexplained headaches.
I think I'm pretty much going in and out of consciousness at that point. I remember the needle's pretty big. You try to go to another place.
3 hours after the procedure, Anne is completely drained by everything she's been through, and she's barely able to talk to the next doctor that comes in to check on her. Finally, after 2 days under the blue lights, she begins to get better, but not as quickly as the doctors were expecting.
When her Billy levels began to drop, we were still hearing from the doctors, she should be responding more dramatically than this to treatment.
Then, on her 3rd day in the ICU, something terrifying happens.
One of the nurses came in to take her out of the room for a regular checkup. Her skin looked a funny color, kind of a greenish, grayish color. When they took her out of the room, I expected them to bring her back.
After 3 straight days in the hospital, Jake steps out for a break while Brenda waits for Isabel. Jake hasn't been gone for 10 minutes when a doctor comes back without Isabel and gives Brenda some devastating news.
She comes in and she said very bluntly, "We think Isabel is in heart failure."
3 hours after the procedure, Anne is completely drained by everything she's been through, and she's barely able to talk to the next doctor that comes in to check on her, neurologist Bennett Rosenthal.
I was asked to see Anne in the hospital. It was a routine consultation for headache.
Dr. Rosenthal begins by asking Anne for very specific details about everything she's experienced over the past 7 months. Then he performs a few basic neurological tests to help him begin piecing together her perplexing symptoms.
The first thing that was suspicious was that her headache was worse when she sat up or stood up and significantly better when she was laying down flat. And her complaints of watery leakage and a metallic taste suggested, well, maybe this is not really a sinus infection, but something else going on.
As soon as Dr. Rosenthal reviews the results of Anne's spinal tap, he knows he's onto something.
When the spinal tap was done, they measured the pressure of the spinal fluid that we call the opening pressure. And the opening pressure normally ranges between 15 to 20 centimeters. Hers was 1.
And when Tom insists that Dr. Rosenthal review Anne's initial MRI that seemed to be normal, he scrutinizes every last detail.
When I looked at Anne's MRI, I saw that she had very small ventricles, the openings in the very center of the brain that contain spinal fluid. For her age, that was a small size and not what I expected to see.
He said that this was very unusual. There was no fluid in the ventricles. Whatever my body was producing constantly was just leaking out.
Based on all the information that we had available, it could be determined that Anne had a cerebrospinal fluid leak.
I waited for the doctor to leave the room, and as soon as she was done, I burst into tears. It was the hardest thing I'd ever heard.
She called me and said, "Mom, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with Isabel."
She had a heart murmur, and in addition to the murmur, she was tired, not eating well, her skin color, it was mottled. She wasn't doing well. And they did an x-ray. And her heart was enlarged.
The hospital they're at is too small to handle such a serious problem. They'll have to transport Isabel immediately to a larger facility with a full pediatric ICU.
They gave her medication to cause her to remain unconscious. They hooked her up to IVs.
They were going to intubate her because the medication they were giving her sometimes caused children to stop breathing.
In the middle of all of this, Jake returns and can't believe what's happening.
I was gone for maybe a half hour. And when I get back, my daughter's in an incubator, and she's got paramedics around her. I see a tube down her throat, and it was breathing for her.
Isabel is quickly loaded into the ambulance, and her terrified family follows behind.
On the drive to the hospital, we were scared to death that the worst was happening. We felt powerless.
I thought she was a goner. I was going to lose her.
When we got to the pediatric intensive care unit, Isabel was just hooked up to all types of monitor machines, and they just instantly started running tests.
She was just a bundle of wires and tape and everything else. And the pediatric cardiologist actually came into Isabel's room, and the first thing he said was, "Good news, she's not in heart failure."
A cerebral spinal fluid leak, or CSF leak, happens when the fluid surrounding the brain and spinal cord leaks. This fluid plays a crucial role in the body because it cushions and protects the brain and spinal cord from both trauma and infection. When there's a decrease in fluid, the nerves in the brain can end up pushing directly against the skull, causing severe pain. In most cases, a CSF leak occurs after a head, brain, or spinal injury, but in some patients, like Anne, doctors believe that the leak happens spontaneously, without any obvious cause.
I had never heard of this type of leak before, and it was kind of scary, but at least he knew what was causing my problem, and it was not a sinus infection.
While the Hummels are relieved to finally have an answer, they're stunned by just how dire the diagnosis really is.
If there's a leak there, there's an opening and bacteria can invade the spinal fluid area. If bacteria invade the spinal fluid, you can get bacterial meningitis, which is a potentially fatal condition.
With no time to lose, Dr. Rosenthal immediately starts Anne on medications that will hopefully repair the leak. But within a few days, it's clear that the prescription isn't working.
It just wouldn't heal on its own, and at the same time, my vital signs were just getting worse and worse and worse.
At that point, her care pretty much was transferred out of my hands and into the neurosurgical and ear, nose, and throat doctors for them to help evaluate where the source of the CSF leak was.
Just 2 weeks after her diagnosis, the surgeons lay out Anne's only remaining option, a risky exploratory operation on her brain that will hopefully determine exactly where the leak is.
I was not doing well at all. I'm usually strong enough to make it through anything, but my body had just felt like it had been through a war, and I just didn't know that I was going to be able to make it through that surgery.
The doctors tell the Kalmalats that Isabel has several small holes in the heart's wall, a condition known as ventricular septal defect.
He said, but this is not entirely uncommon, and it's not fatal necessarily. These kind of holes may heal themselves in the first 6 months to first year of her life, and if not, at 1 year old, she can have surgery to repair the heart.
When he told us she wasn't heart failure, it was just a big sigh of relief. You know, we breathed easy for about 5 minutes.
Then the doctors give them the bad news. For some reason, Isabel has gone into shock. A life-threatening condition in which the circulatory system is unable to provide adequate blood and oxygen to the body, causing the vital organs to shut down. Though shock is usually caused by infection, Isabel's tests are coming back free of any disease. The doctors now have to find out what is causing it before it's too late.
It was just a lot of sitting there waiting for results. She was intubated. She had a line in her neck and a line in her thigh. She was artificially paralyzed. She was sedated. They took blood for tests.
It was very, very difficult, and I know that it often is with babies. They have little veins. I know on one occasion they had to stick her over 30 times to get one IV line in her.
Her condition looked like it was deteriorating quickly.
If they can't get the shock under control quickly, Isabel could die. Pediatric internist Dr. Rama Pullela is assigned to the case.
Isabel was lying in the ICU bed, and she was very weak, and she was ashen gray, pale, and sick. There were two things that were really, really concerning. The first thing is when I shined light into her eyes, they weren't reacting at all. And that's a bad sign. That tells us that maybe there is something wrong in her brain. And the second thing was she was very lethargic. She wasn't responding like a normal baby. If you touch her or if you stimulate her, she wasn't responding at all. And that prompted me to get an emergency CT scan of her head.
And the scan reveals something surprising.
There was a bright spot in the CT scan on her head. In Isabel's case, the bright spot was so small that we thought in terms of calcification.
Brain calcifications in infants as young as Isabel can be caused by many different things, but aren't themselves dangerous. Ordinarily, a baby with calcifications would be observed over time to see if they increase in number or size. But in Isabel's case, time is the one thing they don't have.
For Isabel, I think making the diagnosis soon was the most critical point. Even hours matter in these patients.
They told us that Isabel had been made the top priority in the pediatric intensive care unit, and they had every doctor, every resident, every intern in the pediatric intensive care unit trying to figure out what was wrong with her.
As Anne is wheeled into the OR, her family anxiously stands by, knowing all too well that the odds are not in her favor.
That was nerve-wracking, very, very nerve-wracking. You're really at a loss because you feel very helpless, and hope is everything. And sometimes it's the only thing.
2 hours into the arduous operation, the team finally zeroes in on the problem, a pinhole-sized opening behind her nose where the spinal fluid is escaping. The only way to close the hole is to glue a patch over it in the hope that it will stop the potentially life-threatening leak.
I woke up and my husband was there and my mom was there, and the doctor was so excited. He said he found the leak and he was able to patch it. That was good news.
But their celebration is short-lived.
The patch lasted for about 6 weeks, and then the patch started leaking again. I tasted CSF fluid in my mouth, and now I knew what that metallic taste was.
Little do the Hummels realize that this is just the beginning of what will become a series of 17 potentially fatal operations.
There were a few times that she was convinced she wouldn't wake up, and I'd always say, stay away from the damn light.
My greatest fear is that I was going to say goodbye to my friend, and that was probably the hardest thing I ever went through.
The doctor at the end is like, we have no idea why she's alive. She should have been gone a long time ago.
Then, after more than a dozen failed attempts, one patch finally seems to do the trick. The Hummels and Dr. Rosenthal breathe an enormous sigh of relief.
I think Anne's prognosis is very good. Anne has had a very positive attitude towards a potentially disabling condition. She could very easily be laying in bed the rest of her life, but instead she's fought this and dealt with it and is actually doing quite well.
While they're grateful that Anne has been successfully diagnosed and treated, the Hummels still have difficulty understanding why it took so long for anyone to solve the mystery.
A CSF leak can easily be mistaken for another problem. It's certainly much more common to have the common cold or sinusitis.
When someone comes in with what seems to be an easy diagnosis, that's the first path that everyone takes.
A lot of times we'll treat headache types like sinus infections, trying a treatment approach very quickly without careful listening, and in her case, the listening to her history is really what made the difference.
What started as a mild case of jaundice has escalated into full-blown shock, and doctors have just discovered strange artifacts on a brain CT scan, the origin of which is a complete mystery.
When those results came back, they basically said, we want to do an MRI to follow up and see, because it's not certain and we don't want to worry you.
Then, while Isabel is being prepped for an MRI, another round of blood tests come back that seem to reveal a clue.
Isabel had a low steroid level called cortisol.
Cortisol is a hormone that helps combat illness and stress. When cortisol levels are too low, even the slightest disturbance can be too hard to handle, and the body will go into severe shock or even death. Dr. Palella immediately orders a cortisol drip for Isabel, which should counteract the shock. But now they have a new mystery to contend with. Why isn't her body producing enough cortisol in the first place?
She wasn't making enough either hormones or enzymes that are necessary for her body. Her hypothalamus and pituitary glands secrete hormones, so we all knew that something was wrong with her brain.
When the MRI results finally come back the next day, the doctors are stunned to find that the bright spots on the brain that had originally appeared to be calcium deposits are actually holes where there's no brain at all.
Once we got the MRI, then everything started making sense that she doesn't have enough of hormone and her pupils are not reacting, so we knew that she was having septo-optic dysplasia.
Septo-optic dysplasia is a catch-all term for a variety of developmental defects of the brain. Isabel has 4 defects. She is missing the septum pellucidum and corpus callosum, structures that join the 2 sides of the brain. She has a small hypothalamus, the master gland that controls involuntary functions such as heart rate and temperature. And she has an underdeveloped pituitary gland, which controls the body's hormone output. Finally, Isabel's optic nerves are very weak.
I was scared.
I don't know how to describe the feeling that you're getting told all this stuff, and I guess it kind of sets in.
The missing midline structures and weak optic nerves are impairing Isabel's vision, but it's the underdeveloped master glands that cause the biggest problems. Bilirubin and cortisol levels are controlled by the pituitary gland. Because Isabel's pituitary isn't functioning properly, her bilirubin levels rose and her cortisol levels plummeted, sending her into shock.
It's a very rare disorder, and I've never myself seen a case. Nobody knows at this point what causes septo-optic dysplasia. There's a lot of research going on.
Though they won't know the full extent of the disorder until Isabel gets older, the doctors give the Calmalots hope, assuring them that many of the symptoms are treatable.
Started walking us through it, and I was told that even though the center part of her brain was missing, she would still think, operate, and function like a normal child.
There are treatments for symptoms, for hormone deficiencies, for vision. They try and stimulate as much as possible.
Isabel is immediately started on hormone therapy to counteract the effects of her malfunctioning glands.
Isabel is basically right now getting growth hormone replacements because she lacks growth hormone. She gets cortisol replacements too.
Once she got those hormones and recovered in the hospital, she made a complete turnaround.
In retrospect, one thing is clear. Isabel's diagnosis was made just in the nick of time.
She was so close to death.
She could have died if she didn't have this diagnosis.
And now, just a year later, with rigorous hormone replacement therapy, Isabel is doing well, and the holes in her heart, which turned out to be unrelated to the septo-optic dysplasia, are healing themselves.
I think Isabel is actually doing amazingly well. She has some visual perception. She can appreciate light. She does try and say a few words. She does try and stand up with support. I think these are all good things.
Isabel is 2 years old now. She is thriving. She is an absolutely brilliant 2-year-old.